Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Melbourne's second online water security series webinar for 2021. Of course, it's the afternoon in the southeast corner of Australia, but given we have people from all over the country and beyond, actually, it's good whatever the time of the day it is for you. My name's Anthony Boxshall and I'm an Enterprise Fellow in the School of Biosciences in the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne. With my involvement in the Centre for Anthropogenic Pollution Impact and Management, which from now on we'll call CAPM for ease, I have the great pleasure of being your MC for our webinar panel discussion today, which is, what do Victoria's new environmental protection laws mean for you? Well, all of us really. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm hosting this webinar, the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation in Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge the historic dispossession and dislocation of Aboriginal Australians. I'd like to celebrate the extraordinary resilience of the oldest living culture on the planet and look forward to a very different future. And of course, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Let's talk a little bit about the series. The Water and Environment Agriculture Group at the University of Melbourne work with industry, government and communities to find innovative solutions to tackle water security and environmental challenges. And today's event is part of a regular series discussing the important issues surrounding water security, where we bring together thought leaders from academia, industry, government to provide evidence-based and experience-based insights, basically to raise the quality of the debate around these key issues. This is actually the third year of our highly successful series, and past events have covered diverse topics, including gender diversity in the water sector, which was actually last month, and a wonderful conversation that was. COVID-19 wastewater surveillance, regional research and innovation in agriculture, impacts of bushfires, and the Murray-Darling Basin, just to name a few. If you'd like to learn more about the program or view any of the earlier seminars, which I would thoroughly recommend you have a look, please visit the website and we'll put that up later on the screen so you can actually see that. Now, I do want to note that we are recording this, so you can see all the past ones as well, of course, and the video of this webinar will be put on the university's Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology webpage. Okay, so before we actually proceed with the panel conversation, I'd like to take a moment to thank you who've joined us today and invite you to interact with us by leaving your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box to your right-hand side, which I'm not going to try and do because my right will be your left. Anyway, it's down there, the Q&A box, so you can interact and leave comments or questions. Some of you have actually submitted questions via the registration form. But should our conversation spark further thoughts or questions, I encourage you to engage with the panel through either writing new questions or liking ones you want answered, and you can vote them up. You can see that, website address below me now. We will try and address as many questions as possible. And of course, it wouldn't be the same without a Twitter hashtag. So if you want to have another conversation, which we won't unfortunately be able to monitor live, there is a Twitter hashtag #WaterSecurity21, #WaterSecurity21, which you can see down there as well. So a little bit about the topic. Now, Victoria's new Environment Protection Laws come into effect from July the 1st, 2021, which is actually in about 2.5 months. This will bring about significant changes in how pollution is regulated in Victoria. The Environment Protection Authority, Victoria, the EPA, will have increased powers to prevent harm to the environment and people from pollution and waste, including enforcing stronger penalties for polluters. Interestingly, all Victorians will have a duty to understand the risks that their activities cause the environment and human health, and will be required to take steps to prevent their actions from causing harm. This will be the first time, this is known as a general environmental duty, it'll be the first time in Australia that the general environmental duty has been criminally enforceable. Now, we may shorten that to GED. Hopefully we won't get into acronyms, but if we do, we may. So what will this mean for business, government and communities as well? And how is that likely to impact water and soil quality? Well, I'd be pleased to know that we're an incredible panel who know a hell of a lot about that, and it's my wonderful pleasure to introduce our panel members for today's discussion. First up, we have Associate Professor Susie Reichman, who's the Director of, and I'll say it one last time, the Centre for Anthropogenic Pollution Impact and Management, or CAPM, at the University of Melbourne. Susie's really enjoying the challenge of reinvigorating and broadening CAPM to include water, soil, air, waste, noise, light, and various other types of contamination and pollution. Susie previously has worked for the EPA in Victoria and is actually an expert in soil chemistry, ecotoxicology, and environmental risk assessment. Her research has been incorporated into government guidelines for deriving, for example, background concentrations in soil, and interestingly, for legacy contamination in urban veggie gardens. So if you have an old house with an urban veggie garden, you might want to go back and have a look at some of that. Susie's currently doing research to help establish soil quality guidelines for Antarctica. Welcome, Susie.
Hi, Anne. Thanks. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here. And next we have Paul Leia. Dr. Paul Leia has spent 17 years at Environment Protection Authority in a variety of science and leadership positions. Paul has an amazing mind and is an in-depth knowledge of water pollution, including monitoring, risk assessment, and emerging contaminants. Paul is currently the Victorian representative for the technical review and approval of ANZAC, or Australia and New Zealand guidelines for fresh and marine water quality. As a member of the National Chemical Working Group, Paul has contributed to the development of the National Environment Management Plan, otherwise known by most of us as the NEMP, for PFAS. Now, I'm hoping I don't need to spell out what PFAS is. I'm pretty sure this audience knows what PFAS is. Paul is currently leading work on ambient levels of PFAS in the environment and development of a national emergent contaminant strategy. Welcome, Paul. Great to have you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for having us today, and looking forward to hearing what's on everyone's minds today.
Same here. Now, our third panellist is Dr. Bram Mason. He's the Environmental Sustainability Principal for Melbourne Water. Bram has worked in the past with DELP, which in Victoria is the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, regulating major projects, leading various teams and managing recovery programs. He recently moved to Melbourne Water to lead sustainability responsibilities, aspirations, and help them embed their goals. He's leading the change of management process for informing and updating the business and the people about responsibilities and approaches required under the new Act and regulations that we're talking about. So he's right in the middle of it. Bram views the new Act and regulations as critical for sustainable management of the environment and hopes the changes will create a resilient environment able to adapt with climate change. Great to have you here with us today, Bram.
Thanks, Anthony, and hello, panel members.
Hi, Bram.
Now, last but certainly not least at all, our final presenter joining us is Dr. Jess Drake, who is Environmental Regulation and Soil Scientist from a consultancy, Murang Earth Sciences. I love this. Jess is a self-confessed regulation nerd, which I think is most of us here today quietly are too. In her 15-plus year career in waste, soils, and organic contaminants has led her to develop a deep love and deep knowledge of environmental regulatory science. Her work focuses on achieving the best possible technical and regulatory outcomes for environment, community, business, and regulators through evidence and practical risk-based approaches. Jess previously has also worked for the EPA in Victoria, where she contributed to the PFAS NEMP, the National Environment Management Plan, the new Victorian State Environment Protection Policy for waters, and waste to land research. In her role now at Murang Earth Sciences, she provides environmental regulation science advice to industry, community, businesses, and environment. And it's great to have you here as well, Jess.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to join you all today.
I'm sure you'll all agree we have an extraordinarily well-rounded and expert panel, many of whom are dealing day to day with some of the questions that we're going to be dealing with today and that you've asked. And this broader question about what do these new laws mean? I'd just like to remind our online audience that while our speakers in some cases do work for specific organisations, we've actually asked them to probably put aside that hat in a way and to in the interest of a really free and open, frank dialogue, it means that sometimes they're probably going to give answers as from themselves as an expert and not a specific view of their employer. And I think it's important that we note that so that we can really have a good dialogue. We've had some wonderful questions coming in the registration, and we'll get to those. But what I wanted to do was just to kick off, I wanted to go around the panel. I want to ask each of you, what do you think the main change for our audience is to note with the new Environment Protection Amendment Act? Now, Paul, I'm going to start with you because you probably can give us the best background about what is actually in there and a broad overview from an EPA perspective.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for the great introduction. The first thing I want to say today is that I really come at this from a particular perspective. I'm a freshwater scientist, not a lawyer. So, keep that in mind when I'm talking changes to the Act. So, Anne introduced the concept of general environmental duty really well. But at its heart, what that means is that you'll see EPA move away from punishing polluters because of the harm they've caused to really focusing on trying to intercept that harm before it happens. And so that is because the general environmental duty says that for anyone undertaking an activity in Victoria who could cause harm, they have to do everything reasonably practicable to reduce or eliminate that harm. So you might see some of the changes that result from that are that businesses start to move away from just meeting environmental protection standards to really focusing on how their business can go beyond that and eliminate and reduce harm and perhaps innovate in the way they interact with the environment. And so that concept Anth has touched on is called the general environmental duty. The two other key duties that I probably should just say up front that I think are particularly relevant to water science, water quality and soil science are the duty to manage and the duty to notify. So the general environmental duty relates to any ongoing activity in Victoria from 1 July onwards. But the duty to manage and the duty to notify are retrospective. They go back in time. So it doesn't matter that somebody who owns or manages a parcel of land didn't cause the contamination. From 1 July onwards, they have a duty to notify EPA and a duty to manage that risk. So yeah, I think they're the key three changes that people should be aware of from 1 July onwards.
Thanks, Paul. That gives a really good sense of some of those high-level requirements under the new Act. Jess, I'm gonna jump to you now. From your perspective as a consultant into the industry, what do you think are the kind of main changes for the audience to note?
Yeah, what we're really seeing across the industries that we work with is people becoming more proactive, and they're going away and learning about what they do as a business or as an industry and how they're going to think about the risk in context of water, of land, of environment, and getting really prepared and organised for these changes. So we're seeing that people are really learning and changing how they're thinking towards these risk-based approaches. But we're also seeing other states or people in other states where they're already doing this and they're adapting their environmental management systems for this change.
Thank you. This proactivity, as in not to wait to respond, but be proactive. That's a really theme that I'm drawing out of that. Bram, let's jump to you as a water industry person. What do you think about the main changes?
Well, first off, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional owners on the land I'm on as well, mate. And being the Wurundjeri Boiwurrung, and I'm at the base of mighty Gebor, Mount Macedon, and you'll see that in the background. So I think the 1970 Act was really quite progressive at its time, and it really did put a focus on pollution and managing pollution. But that said, it's really been at that end of pipe. And I think that's been, as we move forward into new thinking in industry and community, I think that's really not the way forward. So I really I celebrate what the EPA, DELP, and the Minister have done in this case of looking at a general environment duty and other waste duties. and actually being a risk-based approach where we can actually look at everything holistically. So I think that's very well done. It's time to rip the Band-Aid off and really look at it holistically. So I'm really looking forward to it, the new Act personally.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Susie, let's finish with you. Just as someone, bring a kind of academic perspective to it, and obviously someone who's worked in regulation as well. What do you think the big changes are?
Yeah, so of course, coming last, a number of things that I think are the big changes have already been discussed. And so rather than just repeat, I thought that I would talk specifically a little bit about this duty to manage, because for contaminated land, this is quite a change. And of course, contaminated land includes the soil and it includes the groundwater. And previously, we've been really connected in with the idea of doing audits and when we've had a land use change. But with this duty to manage, it starts to bring in the importance of us dealing with things like legacy contamination that's been there for a while. And it's not around the GED, the general environmental duty, is around doing some activity which could cause harm. But specifically for contaminated land and groundwater, there's this duty to manage where we need to be being proactive and making sure that where there's any potential harm that could be occurring, even if it's like a legacy contamination in our soil, say, leaching into groundwater or leaching into a nearby stream, we need to be aware of that and acting on it, even if there is no land use change.
It's interesting too, because I wonder, it strikes me as not dissimilar to the way occupational health and safety reversed the onus, probably say 15, 20, 30 years ago. Is that I can see nods from the panel. It's so that proactivity, that duty, as you say, to get in front of it, understand what the risk is and manage it is not unlike health and safety, I think. Perhaps, Susie, is that what you think?
Yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, Ant, because the health and safety approach is a risk-based approach, and we are moving in Victoria from a compliance-based approach to a risk-based approach. So there definitely is a lot of overlap with workplace health and safety and now environmental protection.
Brilliant. Now, I'm going to ask one more question of you and go around probably in the same order, actually. But I want to remind our audience, you can pop questions in. We do have questions. We have a lot of questions actually in the registration, but you can pop questions in down below. Use the Q&A button, and you can pop questions in, and then you can also vote them up if you want to. But so just remind you to do that. So let's go back. We'll go in that same order, and I'm interested in your opinion and what some of the critical issues or opportunities are that it raises for your sector. Now, I'm aware, Paul, that, as a regulator, your sector is the regulator, but I'm just wondering, maybe you'd mind to comment just broadly about some of those critical issues and opportunities that you see.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I can't drive home how much that point you touched on around occupational health and safety, how key that is to understanding the change, because actually that was the sort of guiding legislation that shaped the thinking around the change to the Environment Protection Act. So if you think about that in terms of larger industry, you can see how a larger industry is already used to managing the occupational health and safety risks, and that will be kind of a business as usual thing for them to bring that under the banner of, environmental health, environmental protection, and occupational health and safety. Just fitting within their corporate sort of management framework. I think where I see the big challenge, I think on the horizon, is that I think it's intuitive for people to understand perhaps occupational health and safety risks, but that even in a small business, when somebody goes to work, they don't want to hurt themselves at work. I think the general level of understanding about what environmental risks are when you're undertaking a small business, perhaps a small residential builder, that level of literacy I don't think is going to be there, and that's going to be a challenge, and that won't be something that's remedied quickly.
It's interesting too, and I wonder, and while none of us are OH&S experts, I suspect there was a period where that kind of learning came in those sectors as well. There's a building site up the road and it's a small job and they've got railings up when the people are on the roof, which they wouldn't have had 5-10 years ago. So it's interesting that time it will. Do you think that there is a kind of a period of time in which that building of capability in those small to medium enterprises will occur, Paul?
When you look at something like the regulations that sit behind the Environment Protection Act, they're looking out to sort of 2030, 2040. So this isn't a quick change.
Yep. I think that's a really important issue to pick up early, that on July 2, that same builder is probably not going to get pinged for something he didn't know about on July 1. And there is a bit of time for people to build their capability. Jess, speaking as someone who deals with industry, both large and small, what do you see as the critical issues or opportunities in the Act in the soil and water areas?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually going to say something not too dissimilar to what Paul said. It's really industry is going to be thinking about becoming proactive, thinking about how OH&S works in the workplace, and then how to put that into an environmental context. So I think we're really excited about the opportunities that are going to be out there for business, and that they and the industry can put their best foot forward. So starting to think about it early on and bringing and sharing knowledge with risk-based approaches for industry and for business, and going to community and going to EPA and saying, hey, this is what we're doing. This is how we're trying to protect the environment, and having those conversations with EPA. And also being able to demonstrate that to community as well. And getting that customer and community confidence within their environmental management practices.
Has it taken you as a group a little bit? Do you have to purposefully get into the new Act yourself to try and understand it, into the new information that EPA is available, and then have a think from the industry perspective how that actually works so you can advise clients? Is that something that consultants are doing a lot of right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of industry go into consultants to get that type of advice. And we're really talking to our clients about what type of information they're going to need to be able to demonstrate that they're protecting the environment. So things like having to think about what they do, where they do it, how that connects with the environment. So taking a step back and going, what are the practices we undertake? How could that impact on the environment that surrounds us? So providing supporting evidence and doing that risk management work within an environmental management system or an environmental management framework.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Bran, what about for you from the perspective of the water sector?
Yeah, there's many issues and opportunities, I think, coming up. Melbourne Water is quite fortunate in that we've been around for over 130 years. We're one of the largest land managers in Victoria, and we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of hectares of land management. We're a big beast. We're over 700 employees, and we have a dedicated research and development team. Along with that, we also we take risk very seriously. As part of our statement of obligations, we're also committed to the ISO 14001 and Sustainable Development Goals, so they all tie together. But what that means to us, though, is that, especially with some of the new waste duties, I think some of our objectives around the circular economy and waste to resources, which we've been doing a lot of work with, actually gets promoted forward within the new regulations, which is fantastic. I see there's a really big opportunity there. Melbourne Water obviously treats and receives a lot of waste through the sewer network and stormwater network. And changing the emphasis from the term waste to resources is, I think, quite exciting. And I think it will lead to a lot more partnerships and collaboration, and something that Melbourne Water is actively, looking towards, which is fantastic. We've got some dedicated teams in that area. But also, I think there's holistically an ecosystem approach will come in as well. And I see that as a big opportunity. The environmental reference standard and the state of knowledge and how that will all evolve over time and help us as a society manage what we're doing in terms of generating a product and then sending it somewhere else and understanding what that impact may be on the environment. I think that's a huge potential and one that will possibly take us back to traditional owner knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think we've got a lot to learn from our traditional owners in that space.
I'm actually going to come back and ask you all purposefully a question about traditional owner inputs and knowledge a bit later on. It came in through the Rego. Can I point out, I am coming to you, Susie, don't worry. Can I point out, just for those who are online, we had a question about the link for the new Act into circular economy, and Bram, you've actually just answered that from the water sector perspective as seeing it as an opportunity to drive circular economy. But I'm also interested, Paul, you wanted to just quickly comment as well.
I think that topic you touched on, Bram, in terms of reconsidering waste at the moment as resources, it's such a fascinating challenge for society. And it's a bit of an example of a wicked problem because, on one hand, we absolutely have issues around running out of fertilizers and the need to use these as products in our society. But actually, in that situation, a field that the research I'm particularly been working on is around contaminants that are in those products that are potentially applied to soils. So, how will that play out under the new Act? The way I can see that playing out is, a company who is treating that waste and providing it to somebody to use as a resource, they will have all sorts of responsibilities in terms of undertaking due diligence to test that product, to give assurance that it's standardized and that it meets qualities. And I think probably an area that will come up in importance is around disclosure to the person who's taking that product and applying. You can see that under a general duty, that's kind of where this will push that.
That's so interesting. It makes me think about, someone who runs a small business, but you think about the business opportunity for people there is a kind of a new sector emerging about how to help people explain what it is that they've got here to consumers, for example, which has not been in environmental area, not been a great activity to date. Now, Susie, we are going to come back to you. I want to get your view on the critical issues and opportunities the Act presents from an academic perspective.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this from a research perspective because, of course, in research, we're always interested in increasing knowledge. And just in general, whenever you have new acts and new legislation and guidance, there's always gaps in knowledge. And I think here in particular, because it's such a new way for Victoria of thinking about environmental protection, moving from that compliance towards risk assessment, there's a whole lot of potential both to find knowledge that already exists and bring it into companies and use it. And then also the thing that I love doing as a researcher is generating new knowledge so that we can better protect the environment. So I think it's going to be a driver to the new Act and all of the associated legislation, policies, guidelines will be a driver for creating that new knowledge so that we can better protect the environment.
Yeah, thank you. You've all set the scene so well, and in fact, you've already started answering some of the questions that are coming in as well. And I think what we will do is let's go to some of those questions. Some of them were asked in the pre-registration. I do want to manage the audience expectations. I think we've got somewhere near 100 people out there. I just want to manage your expectations. We probably won't get to everyone's question. There are a lot of you, and there's some fantastic questions. We also, just in terms of time, may not get to hear every panelist's view on every question. There's just simply not the time for that. Do keep popping the questions down below in the Q&A one and voting up ones that you really are interested in. We've had some come in, and I want to jump to those first, and then we'll go to the ones that we had from the pre-registration. We had some really interesting ones come in very quickly just before. and I don't want to, Paul, I don't want to turn this into a you explaining the new act to everybody session. I don't want to put you on the spot there. There's a couple here that you can probably just knock off quickly, and I'll read them out. With new responsibilities for all, where will people be able to find missing information on waste disposal, like water with paint and weeds and clippings? And then the second one is, are you able to elaborate on challenges for organisations that may not be aware of the extent, let alone the risks of environmental impacts / legacies? Are you able to knock those ones off quickly?
Yeah. So, and I think that hints at that there are a whole group of businesses and us as individuals across Victoria that still don't realise and may not realise for some time that actually the new Environment Protection Act puts duties on us all and the way we need to behave and interact with the environment. So you can imagine going from our current acts to a new situation where there's a much broader remit and group of people who come under that act. There's going to be a period of time where we are going to have to catch up in terms of EPA as a regulator, the sort of guidance we give. There'll be a period where, perhaps bigger businesses lead the way in terms of how they respond to environmental challenges. And I think the fundamental thing I would want to touch on that Susie just said is that we as scientists and in academia, a key role for us is to the challenges we take on first should be based on risk. Where the environmental risk is greatest, they're the challenges we're going to need. Now, that may not be grass clippings in stormwater, but you can see that you would hope that was done in a proportionate and risk-based way.
I might just see, Susie, if you've got a view as a kind of a risk assessment expert as well on that.
Yeah, I think this is too where with risk assessment's actually quite, even though we're just bringing it in Victoria, it's quite a mature field actually. And so there's quite clear ways that we step through a risk assessment. And so even for things like if it was decided that for your company, your grass water clippings getting into the stormwater were at a level of risk that you really needed to deal with it now, that there's a set of procedures that you step through so that you can do a risk assessment, and depending on how much knowledge you have, and it's really just about having someone with that experience of risk assessment that you can get access to, whether that's someone in your company or you're going to someone like Jess as a consultant to help you work through that, I think.
Bram, you're at the coalface of this. Have you got something to add from the perspective of an organisation that is currently actually considering this?
Yeah, in terms of the extent and how it impacts on the organisations, I think it's very widespread, and the water industry is really working together to try and understand that through Vic Water, and doing internal gap analyses and just really trying to work out what's going on. And I'll give you a few examples just to help the audience try and understand where we're coming from and where we're preparing. So we're looking at anything from conceptual designs for new assets. We'll need to consider the environmental reference standard, and that flows on to contracts and contractors, and we'll be expecting consultants to then be right across the environmental reference standard and state of knowledge. Melbourne Water is preparing and looking into the state of knowledge and making sure that we have a very thorough understanding of our state of knowledge and how that impacts future on the environmental reference standard. We're looking at procurement, as I mentioned, and contracts. How delivery arm, which is massive, actually will also need to apply the various duties, not just the general environment duty. We're looking at how we may need to adapt our policy and procedures. That's another massive task itself, standard operating procedures right across the board, and just double checking everything. And then there's the compliance component that Melbourne Water is very strong on. We have dedicated compliance managers and officers and a system, and just making sure that system now reflects the new act and regulations, and actually then reports in the required way back to ourselves as an ISO accredited organisation, but also under the responsibilities of the new acts and regulations back to the EPA. So we will be working hopefully quite closely with the EPA on making sure that our our compliance itself is fit for purpose and meets the new regulations.
Gosh, I can't help. Sorry, no, go for it.
Quite broad.
Yes, yeah, I'm getting that sense. I can't help thinking, I don't mean to be glib, but gosh, Jess, you guys are going to be busy in the consulting world in the next few years. And while I've got you there, Jess, we had a question that came in during registration that pointed out the ACT, Australian Capital Territory, already has a general environment duty. And the person was asking, are there lessons we can learn from that? So you work a little bit in the ACT, Jess. Is there something we can learn?
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, we just need to acknowledge that the regulatory frameworks are different between the states and that there's also different legal obligations between the states. And despite there being a presence of a GED in both states. So really these are lessons that we've seen along the way, or information that we've seen with the GED being applied in ACT. We think it really shapes how businesses think about environmental protection. So especially when they're in the establishment phase, so they're going away and thinking about how they operate within their environment and really providing good quality environmental management systems that are both evidence and risk-based. So they're thinking about how are we working within the environment, how might we be impacting on soil and water in our day-to-day duties, but and day-to-day programs, but also in planning. And we're seeing that a lot of those businesses are really using that to showcase their environmental credibility, and that's helping them bring ongoing clients. They're also building community confidence. So there's a lot that we can learn by going to colleagues in the states that have GEDs and asking them about what they do, what type of approaches do they have in their workplace, what type of risk management procedures do they use, both in the short and in the long term for their businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a really good advice. Paul, is there, as Jess mentioned, there are other states with GEDs. I think the difference in the Victorian one is it's criminally enforceable. Is there anything that, as an organisation, that you've taken from the way GEDs have been rolled out in other states?
Look, certainly we have to learn from the experience in other states and jurisdictions, but the key distinction in Victoria is that this is our primary response to environmental harm. That in other jurisdictions, if you don't meet the general environmental, you might be issued with a notice. In Victoria, if you aren't able to show that you've minimised harm, eliminated harm, then that's a breach of the criminal. It's a criminally enforceable part of the act.
Yep. We're getting some fantastic questions. Keep going, keep popping them in. We'll try and get through them all. I want to jump to this really interesting one about someone makes the statement, we are missing, Nick actually makes the statement, we are missing Oz guidelines for many important contaminants. I'm going to ask you this, Susie. How do we fill that gap? And don't just say, give me more research money, please. The GED, and the comment is, the GED looks great for consultants and environmental lawyers. That's the comment. But how do we fill those gaps about those missing guidelines?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the powerful things about risk assessment, because risk assessment can work within the amount of knowledge that you have. And so, part of what you come out of the end of a risk assessment with is the level of certainty you have in that risk. And part of that uncertainty may be because you don't have a lot of, there's not a lot of knowledge there to use. But talking specifically more about guidelines for many contaminants, I mean, a big part of the new act is actually that in a way we're moving away from having these specific numbers and we're moving towards, again, minimising risk is the term that's used. And so it's more about going out there, finding the knowledge that does exist, whether that's in the grey literature. There's a number of databases online that have, sort of toxicity information and harm and hazard information. And building it for your situation. And I think one of the key differences now is a lot of organisations, they have to measure for everything on all of the list of contaminants all the time, whereas part of a risk assessment is you work out which contaminants you need to measure for. And then I think one of the underlying principles, there's a number of underlying principles in the Act for how to deal with risk assessments. And one of them is the state of knowledge. So if the state of knowledge is less, there isn't the expectation that you're going to do the same, have the same level of certainty around the risk assessment that you do. And so the idea is that the risk assessment that your organisation would do for contaminants where we don't have specific guidance on them and don't have as much information would be proportional to the level of knowledge that's there. And then depending too on how much harm you thought, from your risk assessment that it came out, you might also then decide if there wasn't very much information that you needed to go and maybe develop more information so that you could do a risk assessment that you had more certainty around for those contaminants.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. And without you don't have to address the little dig at consultants and environmental lawyers, but just did you want to build on that from the perspective of at that coalface?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really want to echo what Susie's saying. And we're actually doing a lot of that already for our clients. We're actually, there's a lot of frustration. We're like, oh, there's all these contaminants. There's over 40,000 chemicals used in Australia that could be ending up in the environment. So where do we start? And taking a step back and thinking about new ways to go through this problem. And I echo with what Susie's saying as well. It's going through risk management process and looking for evidence, and then getting some of that and going and having a conversation with EPA and saying, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we found through our risk and evidence-based approach. This is how we think we should manage this particular problem, and having that conversation and getting back feedback for a practical solution to the problem on the ground.
Paul will be giving your number at the end for people. No, I'm kidding. I do think that, as Bram was saying, that collaborative conversation, and I am hearing that from Paul as well, that welcoming of that collaborative conversation to work through this, I think that is really good advice, Jess. We've been asked a couple of really fantastic questions, and I'm just trying to work out which one to go to next. And I think we're going to go with this one, which. I can't see who it came from. It's an anonymous, actually. How will business demonstrate they've complied with the Act? Now, Bram, you've touched on this. And how will they demonstrate that they've met best practice? And I wonder if we could go to you, Bram, just quickly to kind of reprise some of those things you talked about and maybe expand a little bit about what you as an organisation are doing to be able to show that.
Yeah, I see compliance in two different areas. One would be really in the post-approval process. So after the permissioning has occurred, and whether it's a license or whatever the case may be, Melbourne Water has quite a sophisticated system called IRIS, where we track all of those approval processes, and we monitor the implementation and any non-conformance associated with that. So we're really quite sophisticated in that space. And there's a number of organisations in other water industries that use a similar approach. But then there's the other approach where, which is really around the duties and the general environment duty, and which is a bit more wider, expansive, and it's almost post-approval where you must be considering those type of aspects. And in that case, we have our aspects and impacts register and a CEFA process, which is where we consider basically all the post-approval, and project planning processes, and we build in what the duty of environmental, so the general environment duty may be, or the waste duty, or the duty to report contamination. That all gets built in our pre-planning stages as well under this CEFA, which is a stakeholder environment, health and planning process, which again is really quite progressive. I've worked in many organisations. I haven't come across the CEFA type process before. So
it sounds to me to be a very matured practice and process, and in a way there's probably representatives, organisations listening thinking, gosh, we haven't got that yet, but it sounds like that's an aspiration to move towards that. Paul, you look like you want to jump in there with a comment.
Yeah, I mean, what Graham's describing there is, a very mature environmental management system. And going back to my point earlier, like you would expect across Victoria, you will see a huge gradient of understanding about environmental risks in undertaking a business. So the expectation for a large organisation like Melbourne Water are going to be very different to a small industry in a small building in an industrial estate. Like the expectations will be very different, and that's absolutely built into the expectations of the Act, where it's been touched on before, but there's this concept of state of knowledge, and that really refers to what a person undertaking a business of that type should know about the expectations of them from an environmental management point of view. That might just mean that they've considered the risk like you would with your occupational health and safety. They've documented it and they should put it on record. That might be compliance.
I'm going to come back to the comparison to IHS in a tick, but I want to change topic completely, actually, and go back to a topic we touched on very earlier, and it was a question that came through registration. How are or were Aboriginal corporations, so traditional owner corps, involved in the either writing of, development of, and or the enforcement of the new environmental laws? Now, Paul, I just want to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you got any insights into the role of traditional owners in either developing or enforcing, or even perhaps more broadly, how the new Act and regulations treat things like traditional owner values and culture?
Yeah. I can't comment on in terms of the development of the Act, but what I'm a lot more familiar with is the development of what are currently the state environment protection policies, and that will become environmental reference standards from July onwards. I think a quick synopsis of where we're at is the infrastructure there to incorporate traditional owner knowledge into setting environmental standards is there, but we haven't progressed so far as to be able to say for the Wurundjeri in this part of Victoria, the particular things that we value and that we want to protect. So as environmental reference standards get updated, the ambition is really to incorporate that traditional owner knowledge into setting those standards.
Ram, you touched on this earlier. Have you got anything to add?
Well, only that Melbourne Water, deeply respects traditional owners. We have our own internal unit dedicated to Indigenous culture and relationships, and that type of practice and culture is built into all of our different strategies, such as the healthy waterway strategy, flood strategy, the sewage strategy, and others that are under development that then direct our business planning and actions. And we see it as an opportunity, personally.
It's interesting too, because I think as you're kind of saying, and Paul's suggesting, parallel to processes like this is a sea change in the relationship between Aboriginal Australians and governments. In particular in Victoria, for those who are outside of Victoria, Victoria is one of the very few Australian jurisdictions to have a treaty process going on at a state level. So it does start to really change that relationship. So thank you for that. I want to jump to a very different question and go back to IHS. If the question is, and thank you, Justin, for this, if we're shifting to OH&S like proactive measures, would there be inspections? How would an inspection work, given how much more complex some of these issues like notification of contamination in a broad area, or some of those complex contamination questions? So maybe Paul, a quick one, and then Jess, I'd love to hear what you're advising your sectors.
Yeah, I think you can certainly expect to see a focus on inspections, but clearly that's not all of Victoria all at once, and it would have to be on the basis of our understanding of where the risks are greatest. I should say that the thing that sits behind all of the general environmental duty is a new, what has been in the past our licensing scheme. It's now called permissioning, and that introduces 3 different tiers of permissions. And so you could expect to see the inspections sort of geared to the different risks that come with those different level of permissions.
Jess, how are you approaching this within, your kind of the groups that you work with in soil and water? Oh, and you're on mute. So just charades. That's my preferred. That's all right. Just charades.
I'm very sorry, Ant, but I lost sound for about the last 3 minutes, so I completely missed that question and answer.
Oh no, it's okay.
Very sorry about that.
No, not at all. It was a question about inspections. Given that we're going to a kind of an OH&S-like proactive approach, would there be inspections? Which Paul has said yes, there would, although they won't be all over Victoria all at once on July 2 for every industry. And the question was, how does an inspection work, particularly for a complex contaminant or mix of contaminants in a site? And I'm just wondering, is that something that's come up within the your sector and with consultants?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that's definitely come up in the other states that we work with that have GEDs, and how we work with the different environmental protection authorities in those states to go through some of those particular issues. So I actually probably can't comment much more on that. It's actually Jules, who's my business partner, who does most of that work in our field. Yeah.
No worries. I'm going to jump to one last one. There's so many wonderful audience questions, and I might actually ask. Someone asked, are there grants or support for small businesses available? And I don't know. I'll put it to anyone on the panel. If anyone has seen any kind of support available, no, doesn't look like anyone's going to jump in. So we might follow up on that. It's worthwhile, I suspect, going and having a look. Paul, sorry.
Yeah, I honestly I haven't heard of something like that, but I would urge people, the very top of EPA's website, there's a header, new laws are coming, click on that, and that would be the best place to start.
All right, fantastic. So then the last question I want to address is this question about what are some of the negatives or downsides of this new regulation, and then about how it'll be monitored, which we kind of talked a bit about. But Susie, I'll go to you first and then Bram. Susie.
Yeah, so this is, I'm not 100% sure it's going to be a negative. I hope it won't, but it's something I'm concerned about. And this is connected in with the GED, the General Environmental Duty, because, of course, previously it's been organisations that are accountable, whereas now all of us as individuals are accountable. And so just how that's going to play out. And I have discussed that with people at EPA. I was on a working group when the subordinate legislation was being developed, and it came up many times, and we were assured every time that was not the intent of the GED. But I still have a bit of concern. And for me in particular, where the concern sits is we get quite a lot of people volunteering their back gardens, their veggie patches, to do research so that we can understand what the situation is. And I really hope that we're not going to end up in a situation where people are scared to do that, because then they might know that they have contamination in their back garden. That they then have to do something about, but because they're individuals, they don't really know what to do about it. And so I think how that gets managed so that it ends up being it's not like an unintended negative consequence, I think is going to be very important.
How interesting. Bram, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think some of the unknowns will be quite a potential negative in that as we discover more, and actually knowing what to do about, say, emerging contaminants, like Susie's saying, in people's backyards or waterways or whatever the case may be. And then to me, one of the negatives would be being really proactive and making sure that we're being a good corporate citizen and not being regulated too severely, I suppose you could say.
As in stepping up, being proactive about it rather than waiting to be regulated. Yep.
Sorry.
So look, there's never enough time to get to the questions. We have a full board of questions. We could go on for the next 2.5 hours. We've got about 4 minutes. So what I'm going to do is ask the last question of the panel. You have about 30 to 45 seconds each. from what you've seen and heard, I just want to hear your most important take-home message. What's the one thing you want the audience to leave here thinking about the new Act? Let's go with you, Bram, 30 seconds.
I think the changes are going to be more widespread than we actually understand. The whole concept of a general environment duty is huge. So just getting to terms with that will be quite difficult, I think, for many different industries.
Yep.
And I would like to say, though, that I think it's a great approach. And, having young children, I think that's the future. So we're protecting the future for the new generation. So no, all power to the EPA there. That's great.
And Jess, your one thing for the audience?
Yeah, I think it's really about seeing it as an opportunity to be proactive and to demonstrate what's best practice and to work with regulators and the community to protect the environment and taking that best foot forward approach.
How about you, Paul? The one thing you want the audience to leave here thinking about the new Act?
Well, look, I think if you think about yourself, whether as a business or an individual, and how you go about managing occupational health and safety, and you apply that thinking to how you can manage your environmental management risks, I think you'll go a long way to getting ready for 1 July.
Susie, last but not least, what's the one thing you'd like the audience to leave here thinking about the new Act?
So I think while moving across to this risk assessment approach is very challenging and very different and new, I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to put the emphasis where the most chance of environmental harm is. And also then where there are some situations where we might not, we might be sort of over-regulating at the moment, there's also the opportunity to step back there. So I think there's this really good opportunity to get our responses in proportion to the potential environmental harm that could be caused by, say, various contaminants in the environment.
What a wonderful discussion. I just think this has been so rich. And look, on behalf of the Water, Environment and Agriculture Program, CAPM and the University of Melbourne, I'd like to thank our panel for your contribution to the discussion. So thanks again, Susie, Paul, Bram and Jess. Just a small round of applause from me. I'm sure the other 100 and whatever are applauding as well. I'd also like to thank our audience for all your questions and your interest on this important issue. A big thanks to all the people behind the scene, Julia, Chloe, Caitlin, and a very special thanks to Associate Professors Meenakshi Arora and Sharon Davis, who make this series into the great series that it is. There's another seminar coming up. As I flagged earlier, the next in the water security series is on May 12. You can see that on screen. What would future urban water infrastructure look like? What a wonderful topic. Non-traditional water supply options like stormwater harvesting, wastewater recycling, desalination. Have a look at the website. You can see it down there on the bottom of the screen, or just keep an eye out for the invitation in the coming days. Finally, thank you to the audience for your participation, and we'd really appreciate your input in our post-event survey, which is located at the bottom of this video stream within the Q&A chat box that you've been using so well. It really helps us, your feedback, to shape the future of the series. So thank you, everybody, for a wonderful session. Stay safe and have an excellent rest of your day. See you.